I am by myself today. It's not because the class didn't show up. It's because when we initially did this class, it was a great class, but I got home that evening and I checked the recorder and the entire recording was botched. I had a bad microphone. It was an older lapel microphone, so it needed to be gotten rid of. I just didn't realize it, and it finally croaked on me. So, take your Bible and let's open up to Matthew chapter 1. This is our fourth class in Matthew chapter 1, and we will finish the first chapter of Matthew today. I hope that next month, when we do our next class on Matthew 1, that we'll probably do a review, a type of a quiz, a Q&A, an open discussion, and make sure that we're all learning so that we can now share when someone brings up topics in Matthew chapter 1. We can now share what we've learned. Today we are talking about Matthew 1, 22 through 23. We ended last time with a dream that Joseph received where the angel of Yahweh spoke to him about the supernatural conception of his betrothed wife, Mary. So we talked about the naming of him there in verse 21, the name Yeshua, meaning he will save. And now we come to a portion in Matthew 1 that's been debated. It's been debated forwards, backwards, sideways, every which way that it can be. And I want to do my best to simplify the matter for everybody. But at the same time, though, I don't want to get too simple because I want you to be able to grasp some of the technicalities so that you can better explain and defend this text with other people that you might meet one day. We never need to forget 1 Peter 3:15 through 17 tells us always be ready to give an answer to a question about the hope that lies within you, about your faith, your allegiance, your loyalty, your way of life. The word answer there in 1 Peter 3 is the Greek word apologia. It's where we get our word apologetics, which is a verbal defense, a reasoned statement or argument. So we want to make sure to give our answers. And that text says to give them in meekness and fear or gentleness and reverence. So let's not forget that we shouldn't get sarcastic or mean-spirited, but let's give a reasoned defense in gentleness and also in reverence. Reverence for the Creator, and also reverence for those that we're talking to who are made in the image of the Creator. Matthew 1, 22 through 23, it says that all this we've been talking about with the virgin conception of Yeshua, all of it took place to fulfill what was spoken by the Lord, or by Yahweh through the prophet. See, the virgin will become pregnant and give birth to a son, and they will call him, or name him, Emmanuel, which is translated God is with us. So the easy way, quote unquote, here is to just go with the flow. Christianity says, see, the virgin conception and birth of Yeshua is prophesied about, and he's God Almighty, because Emmanuel, after all, means God with us. And we want to cover a few things here. The first thing is if the prophet said they will name him Emmanuel, why is he named Yeshua in the verse right before this, where the angel tells Yosef, son of David, in verse 21, she'll give birth to a son, and you are to name him Yeshua because he will save his people from their sins. Why does verse 23 say they will name him Emmanuel? Is Matthew crazy? Did the author who penned this have a brain lapse between verse 21 and verse 22 and 23? And look at verses 24 through 25 just after this. When Joseph got up from sleeping, he did as the Lord's angel had commanded him. He married her, but did not know her intimately until she gave birth to a son, and he named him Yeshua, not Emmanuel. So he did just as the angel commanded him. He married Mary. He took her. He finalized the betrothal period. He did not lay with her until she gave birth According to the Torah, that would have been 40 days after she gave birth. Leviticus chapter 12 talks about that for a man-child. And he named him Yeshua, not Emmanuel. So the angel tells him to name the child Yeshua, but the author inserts a clause about a child being called Emmanuel. 22 through 23 is like a clause in the story. It's like a parenthesis or a pause in the account here. So some people will use this and bring this to your attention as a Messianic believer, as a believer in the Newer Testament or the Apostolic Scriptures, and they'll try to use this to discredit Matthew's Gospel, and you need to be ready to give an answer for the hope that lies within you. Because if we are a believer or an acceptor of the Gospel according to Matthew about the birth, life, death, ministry, resurrection of Yeshua, then we need to be able to give answers to people that ask us questions or give us rebuttals for what we believe. So Matthew 1:23 quotes Isaiah 7 verse 14. Let's turn to Isaiah 7 verse 14. And we're not just going to read 7:14, but we're going to look at some other things in this chapter. If we look at verse 14 by itself, you'll see how the quotation is there. Therefore the Lord himself will give you a sign. The virgin will conceive, have a son, and name him Emmanuel. That's quoted in Matthew 1:23. Matthew's Gospel applies Isaiah 7:14 to the Messiah, Yeshua, in Matthew chapter 1. But instead of just reading verse 14 by itself, we want to go back to verse 1 and look at the context of Isaiah chapter 7. We've got to forget about Matthew 1 for a moment, not in totality, but for a moment, let's forget about Matthew 1, which happened some 700 years later than Isaiah's prophecy. And let's read and interpret Isaiah 7 in its original historical context. That's the wisest thing to do here. So we'll begin with Isaiah 7 verses 1 through 2. This took place during the reign of Ahaz. I'm reading from the HCSB. Son of Jotham, son of Uzziah, king of Judah, Rezin, king of Aram, along with Pekah, son of Remaliah, king of Israel, waged war against Jerusalem, but he could not succeed. When it became known to the house of David that Aram had occupied Ephraim, the heart of Ahaz and the hearts of his people trembled like trees of a forest shaking in the wind. Now, there's two kings that are mentioned here, Rezin and Pekah, and they stand for Aram and Israel, the nation of Aram and the nation of Israel. And they join forces. Aram and Israel, Rezin and Pekah, join forces against Judah, who is mentioned here as Ahaz as well, which is the king. And Ahaz, standing for Judah and his people, they tremble like trees shaking in the wind because there's two kings or two nations joining forces against one. All right, look at verses 3 through 6. Then Yahweh said to Isaiah, Go out with your son Shear-Jashub to meet Ahaz at the end of the conduit of the upper pool by the road to the fuller's field. Say to him, Calm down and be quiet. Don't be afraid or faint-hearted because of these two smoldering stubs of firebrands, Rezin of Aram and the son of Remaliah, or Pekah. For Aram, along with Ephraim and the son of Remaliah, has plotted harm against you. They say, Let us go up against Judah, terrorize it, and conquer it for ourselves. Then we can install Tabil's son as king in it. So, in verses 3 through 6, Isaiah, the prophet, and his son, who is named Shear-Jashub, they're sent with a message, and that message is telling Ahaz and the people of Judah, calm down. These kings are depicted like the smoke from two smoldering sticks of wood. So the fire is out, and they're just smoldering. They're talking a lot of smack, but nothing's going to happen. You're going to be okay. I'm on your side, Ahaz. I'm on your side, Judah. Look at verses 7 through 9. This is what Adonai, Sovereign Yahweh, says. It will not happen. It will not occur. The head of Aram is Damascus. The head of Damascus is Rezin. In 65 years, Ephraim will be too shattered to be a people. The head of Ephraim is Samaria. The head of Samaria is the son of Remaliah. That's Pekah back in verse 1. If you do not stand firm in your faith, then you will not stand at all. So Yahweh says it's not going to happen. They're plotting against you. Don't worry about it. They plan, but they will not succeed. And a key here in verses 7 through 9 is Aram is linked with Damascus and Rezin in verse 8. And then Ephraim and Samaria are linked with Pekah, the king of Israel, son of Remaliah, in verse 9, and you can compare that with verse 1. Now, it's important to remember these names. I know sometimes we read these names and we're like, what's the importance here? But the importance in the chapter is, if you remember these names, when we get to chapter 8, you'll see that chapter 8 is linked with chapter 7. So there's not a brand new story or thought or account going on in chapter 8. The two chapters are linked. We could call them even one chapter. Now look at verses 10 through 16, which I believe will be the last that we go to in chapter 7. Verse 10, Then Yahweh spoke to Ahaz again, Ask for a sign from Yahweh your mighty one, from the depths of Sheol to the heights of heaven. But Ahaz replied, I will not ask. I will not test Yahweh. Well, Isaiah said, Listen, house of David. And it's standing for the king, right? Ahaz, house of David. Is it not enough for you to try the patience of men? Will you also try the patience of my mighty one? Therefore the Lord himself will give you a sign. Who is the you? It's Ahaz, also called house of David here in this text. The Lord will give you a sign. The virgin will conceive, have a son, and name him Emmanuel. By the time he learns, this son, by the time he learns to reject what is bad and choose what is good, he will be eating butter and honey. For before the boy, that's the he and the son, before the boy knows to reject what is bad and choose what is good, the land of the two kings you dread will be abandoned. Before this child that will be born knows to choose between good and evil, these two kings will be wiped out. So in verses 10 through 16, we see the historical context to Isaiah 7:14, the whole Emmanuel virgin thing. Yahweh tells King Ahaz of Judah, ask for a sign. Ahaz tries to be pious. He says no. Yahweh says, look, I told you to ask. I'm going to give you a sign anyhow. And the text says the virgin, Ha-Almah, will conceive, have a son, and call his name Emmanuel. Now, the word virgin in this text, we need to talk about it a little bit because it reads virgin in some Bibles, but it reads young woman in other Bibles. And the other Bibles that read young woman are not like sideline Bible translations. We're talking like New Revised Standard Version, which is arguably the most scholarly Bible translation known or in existence, in English at least, in our day. Then we also have the New English Translation, which is a very scholarly translation. We have the JPS, Tanakh. We have the New American Bible, the Good News Bible, and the Easy to Read version. These all read young woman. A couple of footnotes. If you have a Good News Bible, or you can probably look it up online, there's a footnote in this text. And the footnote says this, quote, the Hebrew word here translated young woman is not the specific term for virgin, but refers to any young woman of marriageable age. The use of virgin in Matthew 1:23 reflects a Greek translation of the Old Testament made some 500 years after Isaiah. End of quote. And the Greek translation they're referencing is the LXX or the Greek Septuagint, which uses the Greek word parthenos. We'll talk about that here momentarily. So the Good News Bible translators recognize here that this Hebrew term, which in Hebrew this is Almah, it means a young woman. The young woman might be a virgin, or she might not. It could go either way with Almah. The point of the translators here, though, is that it does not specifically refer to a virgin like what we think of in the English sense of the word. Next is the Net Bible, New English Translation, in its footnote. I think you can go to netbible.org and you can pull up all of the footnotes in the Net Bible. There are over 60,000 scholarly footnotes on translation issues here. So it's important that you pull that up or buy you one of those Bibles. I recommend, if you're looking for a new Bible and you want to get one that's a little bit different than one that you already have in your library, to get you a NET Bible with the footnotes. The footnote on Isaiah 7:14 says this. It's long, but listen carefully. Traditionally virgin. Because this verse from Isaiah is quoted in Matthew 1:23 in connection with Jesus' birth, the Isaiah passage has been regarded since the earliest Christian times as a prophecy of Christ's virgin birth. Much debate has taken place over the best way to translate this Hebrew term, although ultimately one's view of the doctrine of the virgin birth of Christ is unaffected. Though the Hebrew word used here, Alma, can sometimes refer to a woman who is a virgin, Genesis 24:43, it does not carry this meaning inherently. The word is simply the feminine form of the corresponding masculine noun, Elam, young man. See 1 Samuel 17:56 and 1 Samuel 20:22. The Aramaic and Ugaritic cognate terms are both used of women who are not virgins. The word seems to pertain to age, not sexual experience, and would normally be translated young woman. The LXX translators who later translated the book of Isaiah into Greek sometime between the 2nd and 1st century BC, however, rendered the Hebrew term by the more specific Greek word parthenos, which does mean virgin in a technical sense. This is the Greek term that also appears in the citation of Isaiah 7:14 and Matthew 1:23. Therefore, regardless of the meaning of the term in the Old Testament context, in the New Testament Matthew's usage of the Greek term parthenos clearly indicates that from his perspective a virgin birth has taken place. End of quote. That is an exceptional footnote by the NET translators. Although I do have a book in my library and it is about the virgin birth, it is a great book. He actually goes a little bit deeper on the word parthenos and shows that more than likely the original use of the word parthenos actually functioned in the same way as the use of the Hebrew word alma. And over time, parthenos came to be used in the technical sense of a virgin woman who had never had sex with a man. He talks about how that words and their meanings change over time. For instance, he uses the word intercourse. Intercourse used to have to do with just dialogue and speaking, but now when you say some people had intercourse, people automatically think sexually. But that wasn't how intercourse was used way back when. Another example, he doesn't give this one, but would be like with the English word gay. Is it James chapter 2 that it talks about one man is in your assembly or in your church and he wears the gay apparel? That's the old King James Version rendering. Well, it doesn't mean that the man walked in and had on homosexual clothing. Gay in 1611 was used in the sense of cheerful, happy, jovial. In the context of James 2, it's talking about a ritzy man or a rich man. So we wouldn't translate that, and modern Bibles don't translate that gay apparel anymore. Be that as it may, by the time the author of Matthew's Gospel wrote Matthew chapter 1, parthenos did mean a technical virgin. Back at the time of Isaiah, when it was written, it probably functioned back then like the Hebrew word alma. So the objection here is that if the word alma doesn't mean virgin in the sense that we think of it, and that there's a more technical Hebrew word that could have been used, betula, in Isaiah 7, but was not, then how can Matthew's Gospel quote from Isaiah 7:14 and apply it to a virgin named Mary who had never had sex with a man? Furthermore, what about the original context of Isaiah chapter 7? Now, we'll get back to Matthew 1 here in just a moment, but we look at the context of Isaiah chapter 7. I want you to notice that the child in 7:14 continues to be talked about in 7:15 and 16. Now, I mentioned this when we read it moments ago, but let's go back over it again. Specifically verse 16, where it says, "Before the boy knows to reject what is bad and choose what is good, the land of the two kings you dread will be abandoned." Now, the two kings here are Rezin and Pekah. So Yahweh is not giving Ahaz a sign by telling him, "Ahaz, here's something that's going to happen 700 years in the future." That's not a sign to Ahaz or the people of Judah back then. So it doesn't make sense. The historical context has to do with Rezin and Pekah's lands being abandoned and them and their plan not being successful against Ahaz and the people of Judah. So the sign has to be before the boy, in verse 16, is the son that the virgin conceives and names Emmanuel in verse 14. Some people in Christianity say, how is a young woman getting pregnant a sign? Because, hey, young women get pregnant all the time. As a matter of fact, most women that get pregnant are, let's say, in their late teens or in their 20s. That's classified as a young woman. Well, a sign doesn't have to be miraculous in order for it to be a sign. Circumcision is said to be a sign in Genesis 17. It's not miraculous, it's a medical procedure. The rainbow is a sign in Genesis 9. I guess we might say that's a miracle, but it's something that Yahweh does in the sky. The blood of the Passover lamb in Exodus 12 is said to be a sign or a token. The sign is Yahweh will cause a particular woman, Ha'almah, the virgin, to conceive, have a son, and this is intrinsic to the sign. Before the son reaches an age to discern between good and bad, the two kings and their land will be demolished. So the sign is not just that a young woman or an Almah will conceive. The sign includes before the son she conceives grows to an age to discern good and evil, Rezin and Pekah will be wiped out. That's part of the sign. Now, look at Isaiah chapter 8, verses 1 through 4. Then Yahweh said to me, "Take a large piece of parchment and write on it with an ordinary pen, Maher Shalal Hashbaz. I have appointed trustworthy witnesses, Uriah the priest and Zechariah son of Yeberechiah. I was then intimate with the prophetess, and she conceived and gave birth to a son." Now, I don't know why we would read Isaiah 8:3 after we've just read Isaiah 7:14 and not link the two together historically in context. Some Christians are so heaven-bent on making this only to be about a future Yeshua. Their context flies out the door when they're reading Isaiah chapter 7 and chapter 8. And it's so obvious right here. Isaiah is intimate with the prophetess. She conceives. She gives birth to a son. Yahweh said to me, "Name him Maher Shalal Hashbaz." Notice, for before the boy, that ought to remind you of 7:16, for before the boy. Knows how to call out father or mother, that ought to remind you, reject what is bad and choose what is good. Cognizance, able to discern. The wealth of Damascus and the spoils of Samaria will be carried off to the king of Assyria. Isaiah goes into his wife. She conceives. She gives birth to a son. Once again, how can we ignore this right after the prophecy was spoken? And before the boy, in verse 4 of chapter 8, aligns with chapter 7, 15 through 16. And then Damascus and Samaria are mentioned here in chapter 8, verse 4. And they were just mentioned in chapter 7, verses 8 through 9. So that's a parallel. Isaiah 7:16 the land of the two kings will be abandoned is a parallel with 8 verse 4. The wealth of Damascus and the spoils of Samaria will be carried off to the king of Assyria. So there's a clear connect here. But what about the name Emmanuel? So we're having the same problem in Matthew 1. And this is going to open our eyes up to what's going on in Matthew 1. And this will give us an apologetic for answering a Jewish objection, an anti-Messiah objection about Yeshua. Because the son born in chapter 8, verses 1 through 4 is not named Emmanuel primarily. But rather, he's given the name Maher-shalal-hash-baz. There's a name for your next son if you're a young mama listening, right? No, I'm kidding. You probably don't want to name him that. The Good News Bible reads his name as a translation. Quick loot, fast plunder. Because that's what it means. Maher-shalal-hash-baz means quick loot, fast plunder. Notice that the name of the son here corresponds to how quick or how soon the two kings will lose. Remember, before the boy. 8:3, chapter 8 verse 3 is explained by chapter 8 verse 4. For before the boy. Name him Maher-shalal-hash-baz because quick loot and fast plunder. And remember here, the giving of the name. Remember in a previous lesson where we talked about name him Yeshua, for he will save, or change Abram's name to Abraham, for he'll be a father of a multitude or a father of many nations. Well, this is the same thing. Name him Maher-shalal-hash-baz because there's going to be a quick loot and a fast plunder. So, what about Emmanuel? Well, look at chapter 8, verses 5 through 10. Yahweh spoke to me again because these people rejected the slowly flowing waters of Shiloah and rejoiced with Rezin and the son of Remaliah. Remember that, Rezin and the son of Remaliah, Rezin and Pekah, which are also mentioned in 8:4 and also all through chapter 7. The Lord will certainly bring against them, verse 7, the mighty rushing waters of the Euphrates River, the king of Assyria and all his glory. It will overflow its channels and spill over all its banks. It will pour into Judah, flood over it, and sweep through, reaching up to the neck. And its spreading streams will fill your entire land, Emmanuel. That goes back to verse 14. Band together, peoples, and be broken. Pay attention, all you distant lands. Prepare for war and be broken. Prepare for war and be broken. Devise a plan, it will fail. Make a prediction, it will not happen. For God is with us. That's Immanuel there in the Hebrew text again. Rezin and Pekah are mentioned again in verse 6. And then the name Emmanuel is used in chapter 8, verse 8 and 10. And technically, actually, God with us should read literally, with us is God. Emmanuel from the Hebrew reads, with us is God. Not God with us. That's a technical point, but it's important. And the word Emmanuel doesn't mean that God Almighty jumped down out of heaven and was born or walked on the earth. It has the meaning of Elohim or God is on our side. Through the birth of this son, which is a sign, and before the son, before the boy knows how to discern good and choose evil, these two kings will be abandoned. That's a sign that Elohim is on our side. With us is God, Emmanuel. So the idea is that the naming of the son corresponds to the historical account that is taking place. Emmanuel is not a direct name given to this son. His direct name or primary name is Maher-shalal-hash-baz, but his secondary or prophetic name is Emmanuel because of what is taking place and because of Elohim being on the side of the people of Judah. So, let's turn back now to Matthew chapter 1 in our Bible and ask ourselves, how can Matthew use the Isaiah text in Matthew 1:22 through 23? Well, it all depends on if you believe that Matthew was just as inspired as Isaiah. I do. Some people don't. I believe that Matthew has just as much authority from Yahweh as the prophet Isaiah. We might even call Matthew a prophet or a messenger of Yahweh. Matthew here is carried along by the Spirit of Yahweh to show us in his penning or in his writing down that there is a secondary or messianic fulfillment of Isaiah 7:14 that takes place in the conception and birth of Yeshua of Nazareth. And this messianic fulfillment does not negate the first primary historical fulfillment of the text. It just shows that prophecy can sometimes have more than one application. And this is the case all through the Newer Testament, where an author of the Newer Testament will quote a text, apply it to Yeshua, and you go back and read the text, and you'll see that the text in the Older Testament had a historical context to it that did not apply to Yeshua. But it's okay, because as progressive revelation develops, and as Yeshua teaches his apostles, like it says at the end of Luke 24, the scriptures concerning himself, they begin to see that these prophecies or these texts in the Tanakh, they blossom like a flower, and they have an initial historical context and fulfillment, but they have a greater messianic Yeshua of Nazareth fulfillment to them. And it's because the Newer Testament authors are inspired. Scripture continued to be written down. So we're not negating the first fulfillment. Matthew sees deeper significance to Isaiah 7:14 once Yeshua is born. The Holy Spirit of Yahweh moves on Matthew to write about this. And through the birth of Yeshua, the people of Israel would realize that with us is Elohim. It doesn't mean that Yeshua is the Almighty. Some people use this. This is so popular to be used around Christmas time, especially. Well, he's Immanuel. He's God with us. That's not the context in the Tanakh, and it's not the context here. Now here, there is a greater understanding that with us is Elohim. He's on our side in a spiritual salvific sense. Salvation from our sins, Matthew 1:21. And not just salvation from a physical enemy. But we see here that Emmanuel, just like in Isaiah 7 and 8, is a secondary prophetic name of the Messiah. And we answer our question as to how the text could apply to Yeshua when his primary name is Yeshua by understanding that the historical fulfillment, the boy's primary name was Maher-Shalal Hashbaz, secondary name was Emmanuel. And the term Alma in Hebrew is not a problem. As a matter of fact, it shows the wisdom of Almighty Yahweh. And that is because Alma can be a virgin or cannot be a virgin in the technical sense of the word. I remember a debate that I had a few years back with someone who denies the whole New Testament and only actually goes by the Torah, kind of like the modern day Samaritans, the first 5 books of Genesis through Deuteronomy. And when this point came up, there's several different routes I could have taken, but I just asked him a simple question. I said, can the word Alma be used to describe a virgin in the technical sense of the word, that she's never had sex with a man? And he said, yes, of course, but that's not what it means. I said, but can it be used to describe a technical virgin? His answer was yes. And that's really the only point that you need. Now you can go through the, I believe, 7 uses of Alma in the Tanakh, and pretty much all of them, if my memory serves me right, can be shown to be a virgin in the sense of what we're thinking. There's some that are debatable, but if not all, the majority of them can be shown. And that's because Alma, while it does mean young woman of marriageable age, oftentimes that meant a woman who had never had sex with a man. Because in Hebrew culture, it's different than American culture where, people are passing out condoms to young teenage girls and telling them to have safe sex. In Hebrew culture, that just wasn't done. Not that people did not get involved in that in past times, even in Hebraic culture. But a lot of times, most of the time, a young Hebrew woman, would be a sexually pure virgin. So Alma is used in Isaiah 7 because in the providence of Yahweh, the word Alma can apply to the prophetess that Isaiah went into in Isaiah 8, but Alma can also apply to young Miriam in Matthew 1 and Luke 1 that had never had sex with a man. We do see that Alma and Bethulah are used interchangeably of Rebekah in Genesis 24, again showing that Alma can apply to a technical virgin. It's just not specifically what the word means. One of the best quotes that I've read in one of the books in my library was by John Walton. John Walton, I think, is one of the contributors, if not the chief contributor, to the IVP Bible Background Commentary on the Old Testament. And he writes in this book that I have, quote, "Someone could show me 1,000 passages where fiancé was used to refer to a virgin, but that would not change the meaning of fiancé." You see his point? So you might have 100 fiancés line up, and they might all say, "Hey, yeah, for real, we're virgins." But that doesn't mean the word fiancé means virgin. So you might have 100 almas or 7 uses of alma in the Hebrew Bible. And they may all be virgins in the sense that we think of virgin, but that doesn't change the meaning of the Hebrew word alma. It's best to keep it where it's at. The NET footnote, the GNB footnote, they're both great. And when we keep it where it's at, it applies both to the young woman in Isaiah 7, who the prophet goes into, and the young woman in Matthew 1, whom Yosef does not go in unto, but yet she conceives supernaturally. So thus we see Matthew 1, 22 through 23 in its explanation proper. And then we have 24 through 25. We'll finish it out. We read it earlier, but when Yosef got up from sleeping after he had this dream, he did as the Lord's angel had commanded him. Notice here there is an agency going on. The Lord's angel had commanded him, which is ultimately a commandment of the Almighty, a commandment of Yahweh Almighty. The Lord's angel could say, "Keep my commandments," just like Yeshua says, "If you love me, you will keep my commandments." That doesn't mean he has a different set of commandments than Yahweh. It's that he is the agent through whom or by whom Yahweh is working. And therefore, when he commands you something, it is as though Yahweh commands you something. So Joseph did what the angelic being had commanded him. And he married her. Married her meaning he took her into a house that he provided. He had pledged to her, he had pledged his faith and betrothed her, engaged, but then he took her, and normally a man would take his betrothed wife in, and that night they would consummate through sex, but in this case he knew her not. He did not know her intimately, and that was because of what was taking place with the virgin conception until she gave birth to a son. To me, verse 25 does lend credence to that after she gave birth to a son, and after the 40 days of purification, according to Leviticus 12, and it's mentioned also in Luke chapter 1, were accomplished, that Joseph and Miriam did have sex, and that Miriam had other children through Joseph. And this is why it speaks of the brothers of Yeshua elsewhere in the Gospels. I don't subscribe to the perpetual virginity of Mary, and I think Matthew 1:25 goes against the perpetual virginity of Mary. I think that's a later Roman Catholic doctrine to try to maybe exalt Mary to a place of exaltation that she should not have. Now, I don't like when some Protestant preachers try to demote Mary. Do I believe she was a sinner? Yes, I believe she committed sin. that does not mean, though, that I believe she was this kind of rank sinner. And sometimes when you hear Protestants overreact to the Roman Catholic teaching on the sinlessness or perpetual virginity of Mary, Protestants sometimes will dog Mary out. And I'm of the belief that Mary probably is the most righteous woman to ever walk the face of the earth. So that doesn't mean she never committed sin, but she would be like Zechariah and Elizabeth are described, blameless, walking in all the commandments and ordinances of the Lord in Luke 1:5-6. Why would Yahweh Almighty choose anything less for His Messiah, His anointed one, His anointed King, to be born through and into the family of? Yahweh made sure that His unique Son, His unique man, His Messiah, would be born into a strict, Torah-observant Jewish family. So I don't want to dog Mary out. I don't want to say she's sinless, right? But I don't want to dog Mary out like I've heard some Protestants do. And then, of course, at the end of verse 25, Yosef, named him Yeshua. And again, the naming of the child by Yosef shows Yosef has fully adopted him into the family. And therefore, by adoption, not just by biology through Mary, but by adoption, he is from the lineage and the house of David. That concludes Matthew chapter 1. I hope those that are listening have learned something. If this, by chance, is the first lesson that you've listened to when we go through the Gospel of Matthew, go back and listen to the rest of them. As an assembly, once a month, we're going through the Gospel of Matthew in our Bible studies, our special Bible studies, and we're going to try to get through the whole Gospel before I die. Hopefully Yahweh gives me many, many more moons to live. But when we go through the Gospel of Matthew, it's a great gospel, very Hebraic. We learn all sorts of different things, and all sorts of different subjects and topics come up, so we learn a lot. We do learn a lot. Well, may Yahweh bless you and keep you. May Yahweh make His face to shine upon you and be gracious to you. May Yahweh lift up His countenance upon you and give you peace. I love everybody. We'll talk to you next time. Shalom.